Hi everyone. Thank you so much for attending today. So my name's Niall, and along with Emma, we're part of the communications team here at the Centre for Aging Better. I'm sure you know us well, but just a brief introduction. So the Centre for Aging Better, we have a vision that everyone should be able to enjoy their later life, and that's regardless of their background or their circumstance. We were set up now 5 or 6 years ago, specifically to look at the impact around the aging population and how society needs to respond to it. We advise and we work with a range of different sectors, including government, businesses, charities, local councils, and we cover a wide range of issues, including employment, housing, health, and communities. Next slide, please, Ellie. So, what is ageism? What we're here to talk about today. So the term ageism was actually coined just a little over 50 years ago by a guy called Robert Butler. He was a physician and founding director of the National Institute on Aging in America. And he defined it quite simply as a bias from one age group towards another, which I think holds true today. Now, a lot has changed in that time. Obviously, in 50 years, thanks to medical advances, we might be living longer lives, but we haven't really woken up to the opportunities that those lives offer us and what they offer society. We haven't really shifted our thinking on aging at all. Now, ageism can be seen as a combination of different factors. So we see it as how we think about aging, and that'd be what we would call stereotypes, how we feel about age, and that's what we think of as prejudice, and how we behave in relation to age, and that's what we would call discrimination. Now, we know that widespread ageism exists within society. 1 in 3 people within the UK report experiencing age prejudice or age discrimination at some time. And we're also aware that ageism is bad, not just for individuals, but also for society as a whole. So this whole narrative around aging and older age is quite damaging. It not only reflects, how we think and feel about others and what we perceive as being old or young, but also affects how we feel about our own aging process. Next slide, please, Ellie. So what does society really think about aging? What are the dominant narratives on this topic? So we're working on a project at the moment to try and get to the bottom of this and develop a more constructive and hopefully realistic narrative on aging. And we want it to be one that resonates with the public in general. So we started this project with the idea that the overall discourse around aging is pretty negative, and that it affects how we all think, act, and feel. Earlier this month, you might have seen we launched our most recent report, which looked into this. It analysed the way aging and older people are talked about across a variety of different sectors. So we looked at politics, media, social media, advertisers, charity. We've been working on this with market researchers Savanta Comres and human rights charity Equally Ours, and we look through thousands of different texts across these different sectors and industries to test and try and understand what are the dominant themes. So I won't go through every single one of them, but just to highlight a few. So aging or being old is automatically seen as a time of decline. So you often hear people saying that they're past it or that they're over the hill or washed up. And this idea that people inevitably lose, their ability and their faculties as they get older. Another being that older people being characterized as frail, vulnerable, or dependent. And we've seen this specifically in the last few months, highlighted a lot in the media with coverage around COVID-19, linking older people and vulnerability. Another, the aging population, or that older people are being a burden on society, that they're this expensive drain on resources. And this links in very much with the idea that it's a competition for resources, that older people are pitted against young and older people are benefiting at the expense of younger people. Another is not just this, overtly negative things. There's sometimes this idea of successful aging. So you get these like super active super agers, and it can be quite an unrepresentative representation. So when you get, skydiving grannies, man in his 90s runs a marathon, very good, but it's not a very representative view. And then there's this compassionate ageism, which is well-meaning, but it can be equally damaging. So for instance, often older adults are seen as being high in warmth, but low in competence, and this can lead to feelings of pity. So I'll run through now where exactly we were seeing these things. Next slide, please, Ellie. So in politics, we looked at political discourse, which largely frames the aging population as a costly crisis. The word crisis came up quite a lot, particularly around pressures on the health and social care system, and it emphasizes this dependence that older people have on the state, and it completely overlooks the contribution older people have across society, including caring for loved ones or providing support within the community. This also feeds into a wider perception of aging, or the aging population, as being this burden on the state and on the population more generally. One of the big themes across political narratives was this intergenerational fairness narrative. So again, the kind of fight for resources between younger and older generations. You often hear this kind of boomer versus millennial narrative, and it's all again around a kind of competition for resources. Um, and the last point here is that generations become proxies for wealth or poverty, and of course, inequality, is not necessarily defined by your chronological age. Even if certain generations generally have had more wealth, it doesn't mean that there isn't poverty across all ages. Next slide, please. So this is just, I won't linger too long on this, but this is the top 10 words and phrases we found across political discourse around aging and older people. And again, you can see the kind of reflection on care and health. So funding, social care, NHS support, services, health itself, all fit within the top 10. Next slide, please. So in media narratives, so I'm sure it won't be surprised to hear that the media reinforces these stereotypes, and it doesn't do enough to portray later life as a time of potential, really. It's highly reliant on quite outdated stereotypes, this vulnerable pensioners, lonely grannies, older people framed as being inherently vulnerable. And this is particularly in the context of news stories around things like scams. It turns out only 3 in 10 people think that the media makes old age seem exciting, and it's really not very good at capturing the kind of diversity of later life. Again, portrayals of young versus old are common, pitting generations in competition with each other for resources, highlighting older people as being this burden on society. One of our recommendations in this area actually was quite interesting, was around the editor's code. And we're asking that it includes age as a protected characteristic. It's quite interesting. As it is, it sets out expectations regards to many other things. So race, religion, sex, gender, sexual identity, physical or mental illness, but it doesn't mention age whatsoever. We've also been calling for, you can see with some of the examples that are on screen here, the idea of like for these media organizations to think carefully about the imagery and capture diversity of later life. So there's an ongoing campaign against no more wrinkly hands. I'm sure you will have seen this idea that stories to do with older people or older age groups are often defined by very passive people sitting in chairs or wrinkly hands. Next slide, please, Ellie. So social media was another area we looked at. I won't have a lot of time to talk about that today, but again, rife with stereotypes, including kind of internalization, which you get in social media discourse, with people often talking about themselves as being old or having a senior moment. It also characterizes older people, and these can be quite gendered, which is a bit of a difference on social media. I guess it's that kind of more personal effect where women are often portrayed either as looking ugly or unpleasant, really horrible terms like old hag, or in a patronizing manner like little old lady. Similar for men, being described in ways that suggest that they're stuck in their ways, terms like old codger, or sometimes as like creepy, so terms like dirty old man. So the graphic that's on screen, this was the language we found in social media posts most likely to describe older people, and it's 8 times more likely to use colloquial and potentially offensive language than in news media. So again, those terms I've just mentioned now. Next slide, please, Ellie. So in advertising, again, I don't think it'd be too much of a surprise to hear there's quite negative stereotypes. So caricatures and cliche are very common. Stakeholders we spoke to actually said, they're aware they're doing this, but sometimes they need to do it just to enable, to get ideas across quite quickly in order to communicate and sell products effectively. Seemingly positive language is more common, but themes of death and decline, they're still very apparent. So this kind of anti-aging products, the whole beauty industry really being built on the idea that aging is a battle or something to be fought, and the celebrating the absence of wrinkles. Adverts tend to portray older people as this one homogenous, disempowered group. Later life, often seen as something to be avoided. So we actually did a visual analysis of a number of adverts featuring older people, and largely across the board, it's the same activity again and again. It's older people sitting in beige sofas drinking tea as the one and only activity. Very muted colors, very passive actions. Part of the problem here, older age groups are often just absent from these marketing campaigns of general products. So phones, cars, washing machines, most of these adverts feature people specifically under the age of 40, even though they're products for all ages. Ipsos Mori had a look into this across the world, and only 3 in 10 people believe that TV, film, and advertising, they make older age seem exciting. Nearly as many think it makes old age seem depressing with limited opportunities. And in fact, 4 out of 5 creative professionals themselves who were polled said that they thought the ad industry came across as ageist. Now, it wasn't part of our research in this project, but there's been similar thoughts around TV with older characters getting fewer lines than other characters portrayed, and it really starts to reinforce this starkly negative stereotype about characters being blunt or tactless or rude. Older characters, I should say. Sorry. Next slide, please, Ellie. And then finally, just before I hand over to Emma, so this is the top 10 words and phrases we found across those adverts, focusing on aging and older people. Again, you can see the kind of focus on death and decline. So retirement, funeral, pension, loved one survivor, horribly as well, abuse. So yeah, these are the terms that were most often seen. And yeah, sorry, I'll just hand over to Emma now.
Thanks, Niall. Next slide, please, Ellie. So Niall's obviously painted a slightly bleak picture there, but it's true. These negative stereotypes and depictions exist across most aspects of society. But why does it matter? Next slide, please, Ellie. It's incredibly important because it sets the tone for how we feel about aging. It affects our actions and our behaviours. Niall touched on this. It affects how we feel about ourselves and what we think we're capable of in later life, and how we interact with other people, both personally and professionally. Niall mentioned we did some work with Ipsos Mori last year. They did a poll across the world and in I think about 30 different countries, and they found that overall people are pretty downbeat about later life. Certainly in Britain, we definitely are. Only about 1/3 of people are looking forward to older age. Half of us say that we're worried about getting old. And then, ageism is obviously much to do with our relationships, but it really impacts in our everyday lives as well. The workplace is one area where we know it really manifests. So over 50s get fewer opportunities for training and progression than younger peers. We also know that many older workers report feeling at a disadvantage applying for jobs because of their age. And over 50s, once they're out of work, struggle much more than other younger age groups to get back into work. There's been studies also done around things like access to health treatments. So for example, with mental health, it's been reported that older people with mental health problems are less likely to be referred for talking therapies, more likely to be prescribed antidepressants. And it's important to say as well that age can overlay with all the other sort of characteristics that might leave people in a position where they're facing discrimination. So things like ethnicity and gender. If you've already got a group in society who are marginalized when they get older, that discrimination can be magnified. Next slide, please, Ellie. And just skip through this one, please. It's just, so how can we shift the narrative? At Aging Better, we're doing a number of things in this area. So we're working with the public to try and develop a more constructive and realistic narrative around aging. That's what Niall's been talking about there is part of that work, and we should have the results of the work we're doing around the narrative early next year. We're doing work with different sectors and organisations. Niall mentioned earlier the sort of campaigning around the editor's code. We're also doing some work at the moment with a big marketing agency to look at the way they deal with age, both in their workforce, but also in terms of their campaigns. We're looking at age bias in the workplace, and particularly around recruitment processes and how we can help people make those more equal and fair. You may have seen we've been doing a competition recently to develop some new icons to represent ageing. And that really is about trying to make some icons generally available to the public and organisations like yourselves to replace some of the ones that exist, which normally rely on this hunched over person with a walking stick. We are exploring the idea of doing a photo library, so freely available images of older people that we think are more positive and realistic images of people in later life, and making those freely available. And we are continuing to challenge ageism wherever we see it. So we do a lot of work pushing back on media articles and things that we see in public life that we think are ageist and need challenging. So what is it that you guys can do? And I think we promised in the invite for this that we would try and give you some advice and guidance. I think the key thing, next slide please, Ellie, is really about trying to think differently about aging. There should be some photos on that slide, and I'm not sure why there aren't. Oh, there they are. I'm sure, you know, as a group and as individuals, you're much more clued up about aging than most people. But, you know, we heard from Niall earlier, the public's views on aging are often based on a range of misperceptions, stereotypes, and outdated ideas that are constantly being reinforced by the things they see, read, and hear. So it's really important that you remember in your work the diversity of experiences that exist amongst older age groups, just as any age group. And I think so that there are a few things, if I can just run through a few myth busting things, and Niall did a bit of this earlier, but actually, you know, people really enjoy and can feel very satisfied in later life. Life satisfaction actually peaks in your 70s. Some data shows most of our later lives are spent living independently in ordinary homes. Over 90% of 65-year-olds live in mainstream houses, not care homes, not retirement communities. And loneliness, which I know is a big issue in the media, particularly at the moment, you know, that affects people of all ages, of course. Young people are just as likely to experience it, data shows. And far from being economically unimportant, which is another reason I think that sometimes this older age groups get treated differently. You know, people in their 50s, 60s, 70s and beyond make a huge contribution in terms of caring. Also in the workplace, a third of our workers are over the age of 50. You know, helping out with grandchildren, enabling families to get back to work, and particularly women. And also sort of volunteering and helping out in communities. You know, older age groups are more likely to regularly volunteer and do that kind of informal helping out in communities. So there's a sort of a much overlooked role on lots of areas there. And I think as members of the community of practice, you'll be aware, but they're a huge consumer group as well. So they over 50s, I think it is, account for more than half of all consumer spending and are top spenders in categories including travel and tourism, food, clothing, household goods, and eating out. Next slide, please, Ellie. And I've included this picture here because, you know, I think given the sort of buying power of this group, it's crazy that the products that we are producing to help people remain independent at home as they get older mostly look like this. You know, this market is so underdeveloped, and I should have said actually that's one other area that we're looking at that you may well be aware of. We're looking at inclusive products, the design and retailing of those products, and how we can stimulate that market. Next slide, please, Ellie. And so to try and end with a bit of a checklist, this is definitely not sort of, I guess, definitive do's and don'ts. And it's important, really, the most important thing I think is for everyone to just try and think carefully about what they're doing and what they're saying. But there are some insights that I think we've generated so far in the work that we've been doing. So the term the elderly is just generally disliked. It's definitely disliked across the sort of ageing sector, as it were. So that lots of the charities and stakeholders we speak to, but pretty much by you know, over 75s, or sorry, over 70s as well. We tested lots of terms in our research, and that showed that elderly, old and OAP were amongst the most disliked. So people much prefer terms like mature, senior, later life and older. Don't use wrinkly hands as an image to represent older people. Again, this is hugely disliked across organisations that work in the field of ageing and individuals themselves. We know that the media sort of generally kind of default to using this picture of someone's wrinkly hands, and it's dehumanizing and it's lazy, because obviously there are so many other ways to portray people at different ages. Try not to talk about older people as an other. So Niall mentioned we saw a lot of this around COVID. Obviously people over a certain age, over the age of 65, say, don't become a homogenous group to be talked about and managed by others, which is what a lot of that COVID coverage did. And beware compassionate ageism. So this is the kind of when it sort of flips the other way, and that people almost kind of have a bit of a misty-eyed view of people as they get older. It becomes quite patronizing and infantilizing. This idea that people are kind of doddery but dear. Always question stereotypes, you know, vulnerability, frailness, you know, illness in older age aren't inevitable. And as Niall talks about, they aren't the way that people in later life want to be described either. And then this idea of successful aging, which sort of maybe counterintuitively can actually be damaging as well. So, you know, setting these really unrealistic ideals for what people can achieve in later life and putting the emphasis on it being a personal choice, rather than, you know, the way we age being down to a range of factors, and many of them to do with the society that we live in and the things that are around us and how much money we've got and our access to resources. And then finally, I guess the most important thing is just always, you know, reflecting the diversity of later life, not assuming that because someone's at a certain age that they are, you know, they like a particular thing or they have particular interests. There's a huge range of interests and experiences that exist in older age groups, as in any age group, and health and wealth inequality exists within older age groups too. That's it from us.